All right, so we've got these mechanics kind of worked out now. Now we need to actually get some data out of the database, push some data into the database. So what I'm going to do is take my user class, I'm going to flush it out. I'm going to use the shorthand prop. So we're going to say ID int prop string first name, prop string last name, prop string email address. So I now have this class with these 4 properties. These properties map to the fields in my users table. So I'm basically going to build mapping mechanics to take the data from the database and load it into these objects. So I'm going to create a user object for every row in my database. So here where we have our data reader, we're going to loop through rows and create users. Now to do this, we need something to capture a collection of users. We could use an array, but an array has to be resized and we don't know how many records we're getting. So what I recommend using is a list of user, and then we cast it to an array later. Or we can just pass back a list. Depending on what needs to be done with this data, depends on what you use. So all users. To loop through a data reader, we say while reader.read and read will return true if there's a record to be read off the stream, false if you're at the last record. So basically, while there's something to be read, read it. We'll say user u equals new user, creating a new user object. u.id equals reader dot, and then we can say field, get field value, and we can cast these to the types. Int, and then we pass the index of the field. So ID is the first field. We can also say u.firstname equals reader, and we can use square brackets and pass that position. We can also do u.lastname equals reader, and then we can also pass the string. It's one of my preferred methods. Or we can say get string and pass that value again. Now the position is more efficient because basically you're saying go to this position, this column position, 0 based, and grab the value out of there. If you're pulling from a select statement where you have your fields specifically defined, so what we did is we said select star from users. If we had said select ID, comma, first name, comma, last name, comma, email address from users, we know 0, 1, 2, 3. Since we said select star, we know how they're ordered right now, but we won't know in the future. So the best method, if you don't know the order, is to use this notation. Now to do this, though, you have to do a cast. So you have to say string, and you have to use this type of cast for it to work correctly. And this is an int. So we have to force a cast from whatever comes from the database to that type in order to get it loaded into our object. So now we've initialized a user with data from the database. And then we can say all users.add u, add new user to collection. So this will loop through if there's 1 row, 5 rows, 1,000 rows. And it'll add a user object to our all users collection until we get all those rows loaded. Once they're all loaded, then we just return them. Once everything is done, we close our connection. We say all users dot to array, because we're returning an array of them in this case. F6, it's a good build, so the code is good. We'll come back to our form, and I'm going to grab from my toolbox under data. I'm going to grab a data grid view, drop it on the form, dock it to the parent so it's full size. This is called data grid view 1. So we'll grab all of our users, put this inside of a try catch block. We'll just have a pop-up of the message if anything happens. And then we'll say data grid view 1 dot data bind data source equals all users. So we're making the source for that grid that array of users. F5. Invalid value for key attribute. It's because I put the dots in there. So here's the catch with this. Unable to cast object from system.dbNull to system.string. Most of my email addresses are null. So to handle this, we can come in here and we can wrap some logic around this. If this is dbNull, kind of scroll over here. Actually, we're going to say if not is dbNull. So what this does is it takes the reader.firstName and it does a type check to see if it's dbNull. If it's dbNull, or rather, let me go this way. If it's not dbNull, false. I'm going to use the not to convert it to true. So if it's not dbNull, you can read it like that, not dbNull. You ever seen the question mark colon? I forget, it has a fancy word or a fancy term for it. But it's basically if true, this, else, this. You can do it in one line. So if this is not null, cast this to a string, else put an empty string in place. So we can do that all in one line. So this will be last name. This will be email address. If you run it again, There's our data from our database, taken from rows of data into objects. That collection of objects is then bound to a grid of data. The process of doing this is referred to as object relational mapping, or ORM. That process of taking data from a database, loading it into objects, so that you're dealing with objects instead of rows of data. There's a lot of frameworks out there that can do that. Microsoft's most notable one is the Entity Framework. There's also things called Hibernate, and the third one escapes me, but there are different tools that can facilitate doing this. The reason I show you the mechanics of doing it is so that you're familiar with it, that you're just not arbitrarily using a tool and assuming that it's black box magic. Having an understanding of what it's actually doing is important, so that as you use these tools, it helps you troubleshoot what could be happening if things aren't going the way you expect. Okay. So the last thing that I want to do, in this part I'll go a little fast. So I'm going to undock this. Take this full size, bring it down here, and I'm going to throw a series of controls on here. Now I'm bucking convention, and I'm not putting labels. That's for speed. But these three boxes are first name, last name, email address. This will be add user. So the idea here is that we can fill this out, add a new user to our database, and then see that change reflected in our grid. So to do that, we have to go back to our utility. And add another method called add user. Okay. Now, and I think I've said this before, I'm all about not rewriting code over and over again. So the first lines are build a connection and build a command. I really don't want to write that every time, because if I make some sort of significant change to either the connection or the command, I don't want to have to rewrite everything. So what I want to do instead is I'm going to grab this line of code here. Well, it's only a few lines. I'm going to create a private static SQL connection, create SQL con method. And it'll return a connection object for me. So now I can say SQL connection con equals create SQL con. So that'll give me my connection object. So now down here, these two lines are simply this. Done. My command text is going to be an insert statement. Someone tell me the syntax for an insert statement?
Insert columns or insert table.
Insert into. Thank you. It's all right. I don't remember if it's plural or singular. Users. So first name, last name, email address. I'm going to put an @ symbol in the front of this string, and what that does is it says ignore any line breaks that occur in the string. It actually treats them as true line breaks. Values. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use parameters. I recommend always using parameters. So @ first name, @ last name, @ email. The @ symbol denotes that it's a parameter. So that's our SQL statement, our insert statement, to insert the user. To attach those parameters, we do cmd.parameters.add. And there's different ways of creating these parameters. We can pass in a parameter object. We can pass the parameter name in type. We can pass the name, the type, and the size for those ones that have specific sizes. And the fourth one is the name, the size, the type, and the source column if we're doing data passing, so if we're pulling and pushing data. What I actually prefer to use now that they added it, which they didn't add until later, was add with value. And you basically put in the name and the value. Pretty quick. So, first name, comma, first name, parameter from above. cmd.parameters.add, last name, comma, last name, parameter from our function. Add with value, email, comma, email. So that binds these parameters to this particular command. Now we do a try catch again. So con.open, cmd.execute, and this time we're going to execute a non-query. Non-query means we're not expecting any data back. We're just executing the command. cmd.close. Oh, I'm sorry. Con.close. Catch, exceptions, and we'll just throw them for now. So that does our insert. From the form, in our button, we will do data utility.add user, txt first name.text, txt last name.text, txt email address.text. We'll just do a big try catch block around all of this. Exception. Message box.show ex.message. So that'll add our user. We can even say user u. No, we won't get into that. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do a refactor. Same thing that we did a moment ago where we pulled the connection stuff out. I'm just going to let Visual Studio do it for me. So I'm going to refactor and I'm going to extract a method from the block of code that I highlighted. So this try catch that says get all users. Right click, refactor, extract method. I'm going to call it load all users. So now the form load calls this method load all users. That method goes and fetches all the users and loads the data source for me. I prefer to leave my private methods underneath my event handlers. It's just preference. But now after I add my user, I can say load all users. Fix my... Oh, this is user. Just make it void. What are you going to ask? Oh, yeah. All right, F5. So there's our four users. So we'll put click add user, and there's our additional user. So through all of this, we've built this layer of abstraction between our database and the rest of our application using this utility class data utility. So if at some point we ended up not connecting to SQL Server, let's say, we connect to MySQL, or we pay our half a penny an hour to Amazon Web Services and they host something out in who knows where for us, because we want to use NoSQL. The only piece of code that you should, once your app is fully written, the only piece of code you should have to modify is this one class. And that's a matter of retooling it, refactoring it, and changing out the mechanics of this one data utility. Making that one change, or that one isolated change, completely rehabs and changes the way your application works. Next week, we're going to talk about